They say the brain still listens when the rest of you is gone. I believe that now. Because somewhere in that black nothing, somewhere between alive and not, I heard my daughter's voice. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking about my house, about my land, about how much it was all worth. 24 days in a coma, and the people I trusted most were already dividing up my life. I need you to sit with that for a moment. Because I sat with it for a long time. In the dark, in the nowhere. Unable to open my eyes, or move my hands, or tell anyone that I could hear them. The brain is a cruel machine when it wants to be. It gives you just enough awareness to suffer, and not nearly enough to do a single thing about it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning. The real beginning. Not the hospital, not the coma, not the sound of my daughter's voice calculating the square footage of my living room while I lay there like a man already buried. The beginning before all of that, when the world still made sense, and I was just a man on a river with a fishing rod, and no reason to believe the afternoon would try to kill me. It was a Sunday morning in October, the kind of Tennessee morning that earns the whole state its reputation. The air was cool enough to see your breath if you tried, but the sun was already warming the back of your neck, coming through the trees along the riverbank in long golden columns that made the water look like something a painter would lie about. I was sitting on a flat rock about 15 feet from the bank of the Clinch River. Rod in my hands, coffee thermos beside me, and absolutely nowhere else on earth I needed to be. My name is Henry Caldwell. Most people call me Hank. I was 62 years old that morning. Though I'll confess, the number still surprises me when I say it out loud, because somewhere inside my head I'm still the 30-year-old kid who showed up to his first day at the Tennessee Department of Transportation with a borrowed tie and an engineering degree he'd earned by sleeping 4 hours a night for 6 years. I spent 35 years building bridges. Not the metaphorical kind, though I suppose I built a few of those too. Real bridges. Steel and concrete and mathematics and the quiet faith that if you measure right and pour right and bolt right, the thing you build will hold the weight of 10,000 strangers who will never know your name. I retired 3 years before that Sunday morning. Put in my decades. Got the plaque. Got the handshake from the district supervisor. Got the pension that arrives on the first of every month like a polite guest who never overstays. And I settled into a life that was smaller than the one before it. But honest. Fishing. Reading. Maintaining the house. Drinking coffee on the porch in the mornings and watching Laurel Avenue wake up the way it had for 28 years. Slowly, reluctantly, one screen door at a time. The house. I need to tell you about the house, because everything that happened next was because of that house and the ground it sat on. 1412. Laurel Avenue, Knoxville, Tennessee. A craftsman-style 3-bedroom that I had spent 28 years turning into something that mattered. I didn't build it from scratch, not the way some men do. I bought it in 1996, the year my daughter Claire was 2 years old, and I rebuilt it from the inside out, room by room, year by year, the way you raise a child, with patience, with attention, with the understanding that the work is never truly done. And that's the whole point. But that house sat on something more important than a foundation I'd poured. It sat on Caldwell land. My grandfather, William Caldwell, bought that parcel in 1941 with money he'd saved working the rail yards in Chattanooga. He cleared it with his own hands, built the original structure, a 2-room cabin that was long gone by the time I came along, but whose footprint I could still trace in the way the ground settled differently in the southeast corner of the yard. 3 generations of Caldwell hands had touched that soil. My grandfather's, my father's, mine, and now my daughter's name was on it too. Though I was beginning to learn that names on paper don't always mean what you think they do. That Sunday morning, though, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was thinking about the river, about the way the current moved over the rocks with a sound like someone shushing a child, about the fact that the coffee was still warm and the fish weren't biting, and I didn't care, because sometimes the fishing isn't about the fish. It's about the hour you steal from a world that wants every minute accounted for. And then something happened inside my skull. I've been asked to describe it, and the honest answer is that language doesn't quite reach. It wasn't pain. Not at first. It was pressure. Like someone had placed both hands on the inside of my forehead and pushed outward. Then, heat. Then a sound, wet, deep. Like a branch cracking inside a flooded creek bed. Then the pressure became pain. And the pain became everything. And the fishing rod left my hands, and the sky, that gorgeous Tennessee sky, tilted sideways and went white, and then gray, and then black. A brain aneurysm. That's what the doctors would later call it. A weak spot in a blood vessel that had been quietly waiting my entire life for the worst possible moment to announce itself. It ruptured on a Sunday morning in October while I was watching the river and thinking about nothing, and it nearly killed me right there on that rock. I fell. I know that because they found me at the bottom of the bank, half in the water, face up, which the paramedics later said was the only reason I survived. A kayaker spotted me 20 minutes later. 20 minutes. That's how long I lay there, bleeding inside my own skull, while the river kept moving, and the sun kept shining, and the coffee thermos sat on that rock, still warm, still waiting for a man who wasn't coming back to finish it. 24 days. That's how long the world had without me in it. And in 24 days, the people I loved most decided I wasn't coming back, and started dividing up everything I'd ever built. The world, I have learned, does not pause for unconscious men. It doesn't hold its breath or dim its lights or wait politely at the door until you're ready to participate again. It just keeps going. Bills arrive. Mail stacks up. The leaves change and fall and nobody rakes them. And the people in your life, the ones you trusted to hold things steady while you were gone, they make decisions. Some of those decisions are made out of love. Some are made out of fear. And some, the worst ones, are made by people who were waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. But before I tell you what they did while I was lying in that hospital bed with tubes in my arms and machines breathing for me, I need you to understand what they were taking. Not just a house, not just a piece of land. They were taking 30 years of a life I had built with the same hands that built bridges strong enough to carry a city's weight. Claire was born in 1994. Her mother, Karen, left when Claire was 8 years old. I won't spend a lot of time on Karen, because she didn't spend a lot of time on us. One morning she was there, making pancakes that were always slightly burnt on the bottom, and the next morning she wasn't. She left a note on the kitchen counter, 3 sentences long, and I read it once, folded it, put it in the junk drawer, and never looked at it again. Some things don't deserve a second reading. What Karen left behind was a girl with brown eyes and a gap-toothed smile who stood in the kitchen that morning and asked me where Mama went. And I knelt down on the linoleum floor of 1412 Laurel Avenue and told her the truth, which was that I didn't know, but that I was here, and that I wasn't going anywhere. I kept that promise for 22 years. I worked double shifts when the department needed overtime. And I worked them when they didn't, because braces cost money, and soccer cleats cost money, and the field trip to Washington, that Claire talked about for 3 weeks straight, cost money, and a man with a daughter and no partner does not have the luxury of being tired. I was tired anyway, but I showed up. Every morning, every practice, every school play, where Claire stood in the back row dressed as a tree and delivered her one line with the seriousness of someone performing Shakespeare. I drove her to school when she missed the bus, which was often. I sat on the front porch with her at 2 in the morning when she was 16, and some boy had broken her heart for the first time. And I didn't say a word because sometimes the job isn't to fix it, it's to be there while it hurts. I taught her to drive in the parking lot of the Baptist church on Sundays when the lot was empty, and she hit the curb 11 times, and I didn't raise my voice once, which I consider one of the great athletic achievements of my life. I gave that girl everything I had. Not everything she wanted because I didn't have that kind of money, but everything that mattered. time, presence. The kind of love that shows up even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient, because that's the only kind that counts. And the house. Lord, the house was part of it too. Every room in that house held a version of us. The kitchen where I taught her to make cornbread at 9 years old and she used salt instead of sugar, and we ate it anyway, because that's what you do. The living room where I installed crown molding on a long weekend in 2005, when Claire was 12 and helped by standing on a step stool and handing pieces up to me, asking approximately 9,000 questions about why the angle of the cut mattered. It matters, I told her, because the things you don't see are the things that hold everything together. She rolled her eyes. She was 12. But I meant it, and I mean it now more than ever. The hallway where I laid the hardwood floors myself over 3 weekends in 2001. My knees, my sweat, my back aching in places I didn't know a back could ache. The guest bedroom I repainted 4 times because Claire kept changing her mind about the color. And I let her, because a house should feel like it belongs to the people inside it, not the other way around. That house was not property. It was 28 years of proof that my life had meant something, that I had shown up day after day and built something lasting, something real. So when I finally opened my eyes in that hospital room, 24 days after the world had gone black on the bank of the Clinch River, the first thing I wanted to see was my daughter's face, the person I had built everything for, the reason the house mattered at all. The room was white and bright, and it smelled like disinfectant and recycled air, and the particular absence of anything personal. Machines beeped in rhythms I didn't understand. Tubes ran from my arms to bags hanging on metal poles. My body felt like it had been disassembled and put back together by someone working from a rough draft. Everything ached. My throat was dry and raw, and when I tried to swallow, it felt like swallowing sand. But I was alive. And standing in the doorway, backlit by the fluorescent light of the hospital corridor, was Claire. She was holding a coffee cup in her right hand. Her hair was pulled back. She was wearing a gray cardigan I'd seen 100 times. Soft, oversized, the kind of thing she wore when she wanted to disappear into herself. And she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on my daughter's face before. Not relief. Not joy. Not even the red-eyed, tear-streaked collapse I might have expected from a woman whose father had just spent 24 days deciding whether to live or die. It was something else entirely. Something tight around the eyes. Something rehearsed. I tried to speak. What came out was barely a sound, more breath than voice, scraped thin by weeks of silence. Claire. She walked in slowly, set her coffee on the bedside table, pulled up a chair. She didn't hug me. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and cleared her throat the way people do when they've practiced what they're about to say, but haven't quite decided if they're ready to say it yet. Dad, how are you feeling? Like someone took me apart and forgot the instructions. I managed to smile. Come here. Let me look at you. She leaned in and gave me what I can only describe as the most carefully engineered hug in the history of physical contact. 2 pats on the shoulder. Brief. Controlled. The kind of hug you give a colleague at a conference, not your father who just came back from the dead. I told myself she was scared. That fear does strange things to people. That not everyone cries when they're relieved. And not everyone knows how to hold someone they almost lost. I told myself a lot of things in those first few minutes. And I believed them, because the alternative was something I wasn't ready to consider. Not yet. The doctors came in later that morning, 2 of them. Plus a nurse named Ruth, who had the kind of quiet competence that made you trust her immediately. The way you trust a bridge that doesn't creak when you walk across it. They explained everything with the careful patience of people accustomed to delivering complicated news to patients still learning how to blink. The aneurysm. The rupture. The emergency surgery performed within 4 hours of my arrival, which, they assured me, was the reason I was still having this conversation. The recovery timeline. 6 to 8 weeks minimum before discharge. Physical therapy. Monitoring. Rest. I nodded through most of it. I was alive. The details could wait. What couldn't wait, what I kept coming back to like a tongue finding a cracked tooth, was the look on Claire's face. That rehearsed tightness. The two-pat hug. The way she'd sat in that chair with her hands folded like a woman at a business meeting, not a daughter at her father's bedside. She came back the next day. Stayed 45 minutes. Brought me a magazine I didn't ask for, and a small-talk conversation that felt like it had been assembled from a kit. "How's the food, Dad? The nurses seem nice. Did they say when you'd start physical therapy?" Surface level. Polished. The kind of talk that fills silence without actually saying anything. She came again 3 days later. Stayed 30 minutes. Then, a week after that. 20 minutes. Then 10 days. 15 minutes. Each visit shorter. Each hug, if you could still call it that, more distant. She always wore the gray cardigan. She always brought coffee. She never once looked me in the eyes for longer than a breath. I noticed. Of course I noticed. I spent 35 years reading blueprints, which is really just the art of seeing what's underneath the surface and understanding how it holds together. And what I was reading on my daughter's face wasn't holding together at all. But I told myself stories. She's busy. She has her own life. Brett's family is demanding. Brett. Let me tell you about Brett. His name was Derek Whitfield. Claire married him 4 years before my aneurysm, in a ceremony at the Botanical Gardens that cost more than my first car, and featured a string quartet that played songs I didn't recognize. Derek was 32 years old, worked in insurance, and possessed the firm handshake of a man who had been taught to shake hands firmly without ever being taught why. He was pleasant. He was agreeable. He agreed with everything, in fact, which I found suspicious, because a man who agrees with everything either isn't listening or doesn't have an opinion worth defending. I never disliked Derek. That would have required him to make enough of an impression to dislike. He was simply present. The way furniture is present, occupying space without altering the room's character. He nodded when he should have spoken. He disappeared when he should have stood up. And when his mother entered a room, he shrank by approximately 2 inches, which told me everything I needed to know about who had been making his decisions for the first 3 decades of his life. His mother. Pamela Whitfield. I need to take a breath before I talk about Pamela, because even now, even after everything, the mention of her name activates something in my chest that I haven't fully learned to name. It isn't hate. Hate is too simple, too clean. It's something more complicated. The feeling you get when you finally understand that someone was measuring you for a coffin while smiling at you across the dinner table. Pamela was around my age, early 60s, though she carried herself with the rigid posture of a woman who considered aging a personal failing she refused to participate in. She smiled constantly. Constantly. A smile so permanent and so perfectly maintained that it stopped being an expression and became a fixture, like crown molding that had been installed slightly wrong, close enough to fool most people, but if you knew what to look for, you could see where it didn't quite meet the wall. Her smile never reached her eyes. I noticed that the first Thanksgiving she came to my house, 6 months after the wedding, she brought a casserole and a bottle of wine and the particular energy of a woman who was already mentally rearranging the furniture. Over the next 4 years, at holidays and birthdays and the occasional Sunday dinner Claire insisted on hosting, I cataloged Pamela's comments the way a detective catalogs evidence, not because I was looking for a crime, but because the pattern was impossible to ignore. "Hank, honey, this kitchen has such wonderful bones. Have you ever thought about an island? Open concept is so much more modern. This property must be worth quite a lot now, with the way Knoxville's been growing. Have you considered what you'd do with all this space eventually? A man on his own doesn't really need 3 bedrooms, does he?" She always delivered these observations with that smile, warm, maternal, concerned for my well-being. And her husband Douglas, a quiet man in his early 60s whose primary function appeared to be nodding in agreement with whatever Pamela had just said, would add helpful commentary like, "She's got a point, Hank. without ever specifying what the point actually was. I smiled and passed the rolls and filed every word away. Because here's something Pamela Whitfield never understood about me. I spent 35 years building bridges, and the most important part of building a bridge is understanding the ground on the other side. I knew what Pamela wanted. I knew it before she knew I knew it. I just didn't believe she'd ever actually try to take it. That was my mistake. The only one I made. But it was enough. Claire's fourth visit lasted exactly 11 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock above the door. Something I'd never done while my daughter was in the room before. She sat. She talked about the weather. She mentioned that Derek's parents had been helping with things while I was recovering, without specifying what things. She gave me the two-pat hug. She left, and as I watched her walk down that hospital corridor, gray cardigan disappearing around the corner, I finally stopped telling myself the story I'd been telling myself for 3 weeks. That wasn't fear in her arms. Fear holds tighter. What I had been feeling, every visit, every hug, every pair of eyes that wouldn't meet mine, was guilt. And guilt barely touches you at all. There is a sound people make right before they tell you something that will divide your life into two halves. Before and after. It is not a word. It is a breath. A long, unsteady exhale, the kind that carries the weight of something already done, something that cannot be gathered back into the lungs, no matter how hard you try. I had heard Claire make that sound exactly twice before in her life. Once in 2009, right before she told me she had backed my truck into a fire hydrant on Cedar Lane. And once in 2013, right before she told me she was dropping out of nursing school. That exhale was the sound of a confession arriving ahead of schedule. It was a Wednesday morning. 5 weeks into my recovery. A physical therapist named Marcus was helping me with grip exercises, squeezing a small red therapy ball in my right hand. Over and over, building back the strength that 3.5 weeks of unconsciousness had stolen. My left hand was managing. My right hand was slower, stubbornly weaker. And it frustrated me in the quiet way that only a man who has spent his life trusting his hands can be frustrated when they stop cooperating. Claire walked in without warning. No call ahead. No text. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and I saw it all at once. The gray cardigan, the coffee cup, the posture of a woman carrying something heavier than she could hold for much longer. Dad, I need to talk to you about something. I kept squeezing the therapy ball. Slow. Deliberate. All right. She sat down. Marcus, who had spent enough years in hospitals to recognize the atmospheric shift that precedes a difficult conversation, quietly picked up his clipboard and found somewhere else to be. God bless that man and his instincts. Claire looked at the window, at the floor, at her coffee cup, at the monitoring equipment beside my bed. Everywhere, except my face. It's about the house. I squeezed the ball. Released. Squeezed. Released. What about it? And then she made the exhale. The one I knew. The one that meant the truck was already dented. The one that meant the tuition was already refunded. The one that meant whatever she was about to say had already happened. And my opinion on the matter was purely ceremonial. While you were in the coma, Dad, Derek and I had to make some decisions. Financial decisions. The hospital bills were significant, and there were ongoing costs, and we didn't know if you were going to. She stopped herself. Swallowed. Tried again. Brett's parents offered to help stabilize things. And there was a power of attorney. I know what I signed. My voice was flat. Level. The therapy ball kept moving in my hand. You signed it in 2016. Before your back surgery. You said if anything ever happened, if you couldn't make decisions, that I should. I know what I signed, Claire. The house. Another breath. The house and the land have been transferred into Douglas and Pamela's name. Their attorney handled the paperwork. It was the only way to consolidate the financial situation and keep everything stable while you were. The therapy ball stopped moving. I want to tell you that I stayed calm. I want to tell you that I took a measured breath and responded with the quiet dignity of a man who has lived 62 years and seen harder things than this. That I channeled the patience I had built across 3.5 decades of precision work, where a single miscalculation could bring down a structure and everyone standing on it. But what I actually did was drop the ball. It fell from my hand and hit the linoleum floor with a sound that was too small for what was happening. It bounced once, twice, rolled under the bed, and stopped against the far wall. And for about 15 seconds, that was the only sound in the room. A red therapy ball settling against a hospital wall while my daughter sat 3 feet away from me and waited for me to say something. 15 seconds is not a long time, unless you are spending it realizing that the person you raised alone, the person you sacrificed sleep and meals and weekends for, the person you taught to drive and held at 2 in the morning and gave every good thing you had, just told you that while you were lying unconscious in a hospital bed, she signed your house, your land, your grandfather's land, 3 generations of Caldwell ground, over to a woman who had been measuring your kitchen for new countertops since the day she first walked through your door. Then 15 seconds is a very long time. I looked at my daughter. She was staring at her hands. The gray cardigan had pulled up slightly on her wrists, and I could see the small scar on her left forearm from when she fell off her bicycle at age 10, and I carried her 6 blocks to the emergency room because the truck was in the shop, and I wasn't about to wait for an ambulance while my child was bleeding. I carried her. I remembered carrying her. "Get out," I said. My voice was very quiet. Not angry quiet. Something else. The kind of quiet that happens when a structure shifts, when the load exceeds what the beams were designed to hold, and everything goes still for just a moment before the physics take over. "Dad, please, let me explain." The bills were, "Claire, get out." She stood up. She picked up her coffee cup. She walked to the door and turned back. And for a half-second I saw my daughter. The real one. The one from before all of this. Trying to surface through whatever had been layered on top of her. Then the gray cardigan squared its shoulders. And she left. I stared at the ceiling of that hospital room for 3 hours. Not sleeping. Not calling anyone. Not reaching for the phone or the remote or the call button. Just lying there. Motionless. Watching the fluorescent light hum above me. Thinking with the slow, grinding precision of a man who has spent his entire life solving structural problems. Because here is what Claire did not know. Here is what Pamela Whitfield did not know. Here is what not a single one of them understood while they were signing documents and walking through my rooms and picking out paint samples for walls they had no right to touch. They looked at me and saw a man in a hospital bed. Helpless, finished. A 62-year-old retiree with tubes in his arms and a brain that had tried to kill him over a Sunday morning fishing trip. They never thought to ask what was underneath. They never thought to ask how many foundations I had built in the quiet. And that, right there, was the only mistake any of them needed to make. After 3 hours of staring at that ceiling, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies, where the hero sits up with fire in his eyes and music swelling behind him. It was quieter, slower, more like the moment in a long calculation when the numbers finally resolve, when the decimal point settles into place and you can see the answer clearly for the first time. I reached for my phone. My right hand, the weak one, the one that had been struggling with the therapy ball, picked it up on the first try. Funny how the body finds strength when the mind finally tells it exactly what that strength is for. I called Earl. He answered on the second ring. "Hank? Hank Caldwell?" His voice carried that particular mixture of relief and alarm that people reserve for friends they've recently been told might die. "Brother, I heard you were in the hospital. I've been meaning to call, but I didn't know if you were." "Earl," I said, and my voice was calmer than I expected. "I need you to do something for me. Pull the Caldwell family trust documents. All of them. Everything my grandfather set up in 1941. Everything my father amended. And I need you to look at the power of attorney I signed in 2016 before my back surgery. Every word of it." A long pause. "Hank, What happened? While I was asleep, I said slowly. Someone forgot that the man who builds bridges always knows where the ground is weakest. And then, in the voice of a man who had known me for 40 years and trusted me the way I trusted him, Earl Patterson said exactly 4 words. I'll pull the files. They discharged me on a Friday morning. No fanfare. No daughter waiting at the curb. With an apology. And a warm meal. Just Ruth the nurse. A wheelchair I could have done without, but hospital policy required. And a plastic bag containing my wallet, my watch, and the clothes I'd been wearing the day my brain decided that a quiet Sunday on the Clinch River was the appropriate time to stage a revolt. Earl picked me up in his 2018 Ford F-150, navy blue, the same truck he'd been driving for 8 years and refused to trade in because, in his words, "It still runs, Hank, and things that still run deserve loyalty." He was 65 years old. Silver hair, military short, wire-rimmed glasses on a chain around his neck that made him look like someone's grandfather, which he was, 3 times over. Dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows regardless of the weather, because Earl Patterson did not believe in casual Fridays or any other erosion of professional standards. He was also, quietly, one of the sharpest legal minds in Knox County. He'd been my friend for 40 years before he was ever my attorney, which meant he knew when to talk like a lawyer and when to talk like a man who'd watched me raise a daughter alone and never once heard me complain. He took one look at me and said, "You look terrible." "Thank you, Earl. Your compassion is really something." He handed me a coffee. Black. 2 sugars. The way I'd been drinking it since I was 26. No announcement. No ceremony. Just a man handing another man what he needs. We drove in silence for the first 10 minutes. The kind of silence that only exists between people who have known each other long enough that words are not always required. Tennessee countryside, moving past the window. Normal people, driving to normal places on a normal Friday. Meanwhile, I was 62 years old, freshly discharged, legally homeless by my own daughter's signature, holding a cup of coffee that tasted like the first real thing I'd experienced in 6 weeks. Then Earl spoke. "I pulled everything. The Caldwell family trust is intact, Hank. Your grandfather's attorney was thorough. The trust was established in 1941, amended by your father in 73, and it has never been dissolved. The land at 1412 Laurel Avenue is titled under that trust. Has been since your grandfather cleared it." He kept his eyes on the road. "And the trust requires 3 signatures for any transfer of property held within it. 3 living Caldwell Trust members. Currently that's you, your cousin Margaret in Chattanooga, and Claire. Claire's signature alone is not sufficient. Not even close." I wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "So the transfer violated the trust terms on its face. But that's not all." Earl made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a laugh. "The power of attorney you signed in 2016. Standard document, well drafted. It includes an expiration clause. Becomes void upon documented recovery of legal capacity by the grantor." He paused, and I could tell he'd been saving this part. "Meaning the moment you opened your eyes in that hospital bed, Hank, the power of attorney died. Anything signed or transferred after that point was signed without legal authority." I turned to look at him. He was doing that thing with his mouth, not quite a smile, just the faintest adjustment of a man who had spent 40 years in courtrooms and knew exactly what a winning hand looked like. "Earl, are you telling me they transferred my house illegally?" "I'm telling you a very strong argument exists that they did. I'm also telling you that argument gets significantly stronger if we let them settle in first. Let them think they've won, then file at precisely the right moment. You want to wait." "I want to be surgical," he said. "There's a difference." We drove another mile. Then I said, "There's somewhere I need to go, Earl. Somewhere none of them know about. Take the next exit toward Maryville." He glanced at me but didn't ask. That was Earl. 40 years of friendship meant knowing when a question would be answered by the road itself. And somewhere behind us, on Laurel Avenue, in a house that still had my crown molding on the ceiling and my floors under their feet. Pamela Whitfield was probably already planning where to put the new island in my kitchen. She had no idea that the man she'd written off was sitting in an old Ford truck with black coffee and a 40-year friendship with the most methodical attorney in the county, heading toward a place she had never heard of, to begin building something she would never see coming. There are places that hold time differently than others. Cities move fast. Highways move faster. But land, real land, the kind that has been in a family long enough to carry the memory of hands that are no longer here, that kind of land moves at its own pace. It waits. Not patiently, not impatiently. It just waits, the way soil does, without opinion, without urgency, keeping itself company until someone remembers it exists. The turnoff to Caldwell Road was easy to miss if you didn't know it was there, which was part of its charm and, as it turned out, part of its strategic value. A narrow two-lane that branched off Route 9 about 40 minutes northeast of Knoxville, winding through hills that got greener and quieter with every mile. No signs. No markers. Just the road and the trees and the slow understanding that you were heading somewhere the rest of the world hadn't gotten around to finding yet. Earl slowed the truck when the gravel started. The driveway was long, maybe a quarter mile, lined on both sides by old fence posts that leaned at angles, suggesting they had opinions about the wind but no intention of falling down. And then the trees opened up. And there it was, 12 acres. That's what it said on the deed. And that's what it was. Though numbers don't do much justice to land like this. The property sat in a shallow valley with the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains rising behind it, like a promise someone had made a long time ago and kept. There was a farmhouse, 2 stories, wood-framed, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and looked out over a meadow that hadn't been mowed in 8 years and had responded to that neglect by becoming something accidentally beautiful. Tall grass, wildflowers, goldenrod and aster and things I couldn't name. All of it moving in the October breeze like the land was breathing. There was a barn to the east, old but upright. Its red paint faded to a dignified rust. And beyond the meadow, at the far edge of the property, a creek ran along the tree line, catching the afternoon light in brief silver flashes between the rocks. Earl stopped the truck and we both just sat there for a moment, looking at it through the windshield. "How long has it been?" he asked. 8 years. He nodded slowly. The way you nod when you understand that the number represents something larger than time. 8 years since my brother Daniel died. 8 years since I'd driven out here alone on a November afternoon, sat on that porch for 3 hours, cried exactly once, and then locked the front door behind me and driven away. Because some places hold too much of the people you've lost, and visiting them casually felt like a kind of betrayal I wasn't prepared to commit. Daniel was 3 years older than me. He taught me how to read a level before I was 10. He could build anything with his hands. And I mean anything. Furniture, fences, the engine of a tractor that everyone else said was finished. Our father taught us both. But Daniel learned faster and stayed closer. I went to college, got the engineering degree, moved to Knoxville, built bridges for the state. Daniel stayed on the land. He said the land was enough, and he meant it. And I never argued because I understood, even then, that some men are built for distance, and some men are built for depth, and Daniel was the deepest man I ever knew. He built this farmhouse with his own hands over the course of 3 years. Every beam, every joint, every floorboard. The porch I was staring at through that windshield, he built that porch the summer I got married. And when I asked him why he was building a porch instead of coming to the rehearsal dinner, he said, "A porch lasts longer than a speech, Hank. You'll thank me later." He was right about the porch. He was right about most things. When Daniel got sick, it was lung cancer. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already too late to negotiate. He lasted 14 months. In those 14 months, he set up a trust for the property, separate from the Caldwell family trust, managed independently, with its own tax account that paid automatically every year. He did this because Daniel, even dying, was the most organized man I ever knew, and because he wanted to make sure the land would be there when someone needed it. He left it to me, not because I asked, because he knew. I opened the truck door and stepped out. The air hit me first. Clean, cool, carrying the smell of wood smoke from somewhere distant, and the particular sweetness of October grass. My legs were still unsteady. 6 weeks of hospital beds don't do much for a man's balance. But I walked to the porch steps and put my hand on the railing Daniel had built. The wood was weathered, gray-silver, the color cedar turns when you let time have its way with it. But it was solid under my hand. Solid the way things are solid when they were built by someone who understood that the point of building isn't to impress anyone, it's to make something that holds. I went inside. Earl followed, quiet, letting me lead. It wasn't bad. That's the thing about houses that are built right. They hold. The roof was sound. The floors were original pine, dusty but intact. No warping, no rot. The stone fireplace in the main room was pristine, every rock still exactly where Daniel had placed it. The kitchen was dated, 1990s. Appliances, laminate countertops, but functional. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a mudroom off the back that opened onto a smaller porch facing the mountains. I stood on that back porch for a long time. The Smokies were doing something unreasonable with the afternoon light. The way they do in October when the leaves are turning, and the air is thin enough to make the colors sharper than they have any right to be. Gold and copper and a red so deep it looked like the mountains were holding their breath. And something happened to me standing there that I hadn't expected. Something I hadn't felt since before the river. Before the hospital. Before the sound of my daughter's voice telling me she'd given away my life. I felt clear, not happy. I wasn't anywhere near happy. But clear, like the fog of 24 days unconscious and 5 weeks furious had finally settled, and underneath all of it was just a man with a plan and a piece of land, and the patience of someone who'd spent 35 years knowing that the best work, the work that actually holds, takes time. Earl was leaning against the porch railing when I came back inside. Arms crossed, looking out at the meadow with the expression of a man who had just added several new chapters to his understanding of what his client was working with. The trust, I said. He didn't turn around. Daniel's trust is completely separate from the Caldwell family trust. Different attorney, different structure, different tax identification number. It's been paying its own property taxes automatically through an account your brother set up before he passed. Every year, like clockwork, the property has never appeared in your personal filings, never touched your estate, never shown up in any search connected to your name, so they have no claim on it. 0. None. He turned to face me. Not even a shadow of one, Hank. This place is invisible to anyone who doesn't already know it exists, and based on what you've told me, nobody in that family knows it exists. I looked back through the doorway at the stone fireplace Daniel had built. Every rock, chosen by hand, every rock still exactly where he'd placed it. 8 years later, holding its position the way Daniel had held his. Quietly, without complaint, for as long as it mattered. This is where I'll be, I said. While you build the case, this is where I'll work from. Earl nodded once. He didn't ask me to explain the logic because the logic was obvious. A man needs ground to stand on before he can fight for the ground that was taken from him. This was my ground. It had been waiting for me. The way Daniel had set it up to wait. And now it was time to use it. We locked up the farmhouse and drove back toward Knoxville in the fading afternoon light. Earl dropped me at a motel near the hospital where I'd been staying since discharge, because a man with no home still needs somewhere to sleep, and I wasn't ready to ask anyone for anything. Not yet. That evening, sitting on the edge of a motel bed that smelled like industrial detergent and resignation, I picked up my phone and called the second person I needed. Bud Watkins answered on the first ring. Hank Caldwell. His voice was gravel and coffee, and 30 years of the Knoxville Police Department. I was wondering when you'd get around to calling me. Now, I need to tell you about Bud, because Bud Watkins is the kind of man the world doesn't make enough of anymore. 71 years old, retired detective, 30 years on the force, the last 15 in property crimes, which meant he had spent a decade and a half studying exactly the kind of people who take things that don't belong to them. He'd lived across the street from me on Laurel Avenue for 22 years. His wife, Dolores, passed 6 years ago from a heart condition neither of them saw coming, and since then it had been just Bud and Captain, a 12-year-old golden retriever with bad hips and the dignified bearing of a dog who had seen enough of the world to form opinions about it. Bud sat on his front porch every morning from 6 to 9 with a cup of coffee and Captain at his feet. He sat there again from 4 to 7 every evening, not because he had nothing else to do, but because Bud Watkins believed, with the unshakable conviction of a man who had spent his career catching people who thought no one was watching, that someone should always be watching. He saw everything. He noticed everything, and he remembered everything. Because 30 years of detective work had turned observation from a skill into a reflex. The kind of reflex that doesn't switch off just because you've turned in your badge. Bud, I said, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be straight with me. Hank, I have been straight with you for 22 years. I don't see any reason to change the policy now. The house. What happened while I was in the hospital? A pause. Not the hesitant kind. The organizing kind. The kind of pause a man makes when he has plenty to say and is arranging it in the order that will be most useful. Well, he began, and I could hear the porch chair creak as he settled in. Captain made a sound in the background, the low groan of an old dog adjusting his position. About 3 days after you went in, Hank, Pamela Whitfield showed up at your house. First time, she was alone. Told me she was checking the mail. I said that was thoughtful of her. She smiled. I smiled. Neither of us meant it. I closed my eyes. Day after that, she came back with Douglas. They walked the property. All of it. Front yard, backyard, along the fence line. Douglas had a tape measure. Pamela had a notepad. They weren't checking the mail anymore, Hank. And you documented this. I'm a retired detective, Hank. I documented it the way I document everything. Another creak of the chair. Dates, times, descriptions, license plates. All in my notebook. 30 years of habit. And the photographs. Photographs? I have a phone, Hank. It takes pictures. I know how to use it. I have time-stamped photographs of every visit, every vehicle, every person who walked onto your property from day 3 onward. Sometimes the most valuable thing in any situation is a 71-year-old man with a porch, a camera phone, and absolutely nowhere else to be. Something that felt almost like gratitude, almost like hope, settled into my chest. Bud, I could hug you. You can hug me when this is finished, he said. Now, there's something else you need to know. Because on that 3rd day, Hank, before any paperwork, before any power of attorney, before your daughter signed a single document, Pamela Whitfield brought someone to your house. A locksmith. Bud's voice dropped half a register. She changed the locks on your front door on day 3. I watched it happen from my porch. And in my line of work, we had a word for that. I let those words sit for a moment. A locksmith. Day 3. Before any document existed. Before any power of attorney had been activated. Before my daughter had signed anything at all. Pamela Whitfield had walked up to my front door and changed the locks. She had physically taken possession of my house before she had any legal pretense to do so. I watched it from my porch, Bud continued. She pulled up at 9:42 in the morning. White sedan. The locksmith arrived 11 minutes later in a van, green and white. Company name on the side. I have the license plate. The whole thing took about 25 minutes. She stood on your porch and watched him work, and when he was done, she handed him a check, took the new keys, and let herself in like she'd been doing it her whole life. And this was before the POA was even signed. 3 days before, based on what you've told me. Which means she wasn't responding to a crisis, Hank. She was executing a plan. There's a difference. I spent 15 years in property crimes. I know what opportunity looks like, and I know what premeditation looks like. The lady with the locksmith wasn't improvising. I sat on that motel bed and let the weight of it settle. Not just the anger, though there was anger. A slow, deep current of it, running under everything, like groundwater. But the clarity, the shape of what had happened was becoming sharper with every conversation, every detail, every timestamp in Bud's notebook. This was not a family making panic decisions during a medical emergency. This was a woman who had been waiting for her moment. And my aneurysm had given it to her. "What's happening there now?" I asked. "Oh, Hank." Bud made a sound that was half sigh, half growl. "Where do I begin?" He began with the curtains. Pamela had replaced my curtains. All of them. Every window on the first floor. The new ones were cream-colored. Cream. "Hank," Bud said, with the particular disgust of a man who considered certain colors a personal offense. "In that beautiful living room, with the crown molding, you spent a whole summer installing. Cream curtains. I have feelings about this. And none of them are charitable." She had also repainted the living room. Sage green. "I watched the painters go in on a Tuesday," Bud reported. 2 men, a ladder, and 3 gallons of a color that has no business being on the walls of a house with that much character. Douglas had moved his car into my garage. Not the driveway. The garage. The garage I had organized with the precision of a man who spent his career managing complex systems. Every tool on its pegboard, every drawer labeled, every surface clean. Douglas's Buick was now parked where my truck used to be. Derek and Claire had moved into the master bedroom. My bedroom, the room where I had slept alone for 22 years, where I kept the photograph of Claire at age 6 on the nightstand, where the window looked out over the backyard, and the old oak tree that my father had told me was there before any Caldwell set foot on the property. And Pamela and Douglas had taken the guest suite down the hall, the room I had repainted 4 times because Claire kept changing her mind about the color. The room that still had the small dent in the doorframe from where Claire had swung her backpack too hard on the first day of 7th grade. "She hosted a dinner party last Saturday," Bud added. "Your dining room. Your dishes. 7 guests. I counted the cars. She stood on the front porch and greeted people like she'd lived there for 20 years. Captain growled. "And I want you to know that Captain does not growl lightly. That dog has standards." I almost smiled. Almost. "And Douglas." Bud paused for what I can only describe as dramatic effect, because Bud Watkins, despite being a retired detective, had the storytelling instincts of a man who understood that timing is everything. "Douglas has started gardening. Your roses, Hank, the ones along the south fence. He's out there with pruning shears every morning. I want you to know that he's doing it wrong. He's cutting at the wrong angle. Those roses are going to suffer, and I hold him personally responsible. I'm just telling you what I see, Hank. It's what I do, and I appreciate it. Truly. Keep watching. I haven't stopped." A pause. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to let them get comfortable," I said. Comfortable people stop watching their backs. Bud was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the smartest thing I've heard all week. And I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, so the bar is higher than you'd think." I thanked him and told him to keep doing exactly what he'd been doing. He said he had no intention of stopping. Captain made a sound of agreement in the background, and then, almost as an afterthought, in the way that a man who spent 30 years catching criminals drops the most important detail last because he knows the weight of a sentence depends entirely on where you place it, Bud said something that changed everything. "Hank, one more thing. That security camera system you installed 2 years ago, the one that uploads to the cloud, you do realize it's still running, right?" I closed my eyes. 2 years ago, After a string of break-ins on the east side of Laurel Avenue, I had installed a 4-camera security system covering the front porch, the back door, the driveway, and the garage. It backed up automatically to a cloud server every 24 hours. I had installed it for peace of mind during a crime wave. And then, honestly, mostly forgotten about it. The subscription renewed automatically on my credit card. The cameras ran silently, day and night, recording everything, including, presumably, Pamela Whitfield arriving with a locksmith on day 3, including Douglas, with his tape measure, including every visit, every vehicle, every key, turning in a lock that used to be mine. "Bud," I said quietly, "I could hug you. You keep saying that. You can hug me when it's done. Now go do what you need to do, Hank. And do it right. Because in my experience, the people who take things from other people only stop when someone makes them." I hung up, and I sat in that motel room for a long time, in the quiet, in the dark, holding my phone in both hands like a man holding the detonator to something he'd just realized was already wired and waiting. 3 secrets. A family trust they'd violated. A power of attorney that was already dead. And a camera system that had been quietly, patiently, recording their every move since the day they first walked through my door uninvited. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in a fight is the one nobody remembers is there. The next morning, sitting in that motel room with a cup of gas station coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during a previous administration, I logged into the cloud server. The login credentials were saved on my phone. The subscription had renewed automatically 3 weeks before my aneurysm, which meant the system had been running uninterrupted through every single day of the 24 I'd been unconscious and every day since. I scrolled to day 3. October 14th. And there she was. 9:42 in the morning, exactly as Bud had said. Pamela Whitfield's white sedan pulling into my driveway. Camera 2, the one facing the front porch, captured her stepping out of the car in a blue blazer and sunglasses, walking to my front door like a woman arriving at a property she already considered hers. 11 minutes later, the locksmith's van, green and white. Company name clearly visible. 25 minutes of work. New keys handed over. Pamela letting herself in. All of it time-stamped. All of it stored on a server that nobody had thought to check, because nobody had thought about the cameras at all. I scrolled forward. Day 4. Douglas with the tape measure. Exactly as Bud described. Day 6. Pamela again. This time with a woman I didn't recognize. Walking room to room. Pointing at walls. Gesturing at windows. A realtor. Maybe. Or a decorator. Someone who had been invited to evaluate my home before any legal authority existed to invite anyone anywhere. Day 9. Claire arriving with Derek. Claire had a key, one of the new ones, and she let them in without hesitation. She was wearing the gray cardigan. I watched my daughter walk into my house with a key that had been cut by a locksmith, hired by a woman who had changed my locks before my body was even cold in that hospital bed. And something inside my chest went very still and very heavy, like a beam settling into a position it would hold for a long time. I saved everything. Downloaded the footage to a secure backup. Then I called Earl. "I'm sending you something," I said. Camera footage. Cloud stored, time-stamped, continuous recording from 4 cameras at the Laurel Avenue property. Starting from day 3, silence on the line. Then Earl said, very quietly, "Day 3? Before the POA. Before any paperwork. Before anything." A longer silence. I could practically hear him thinking, which, if you knew Earl, sounded like the mechanical precision of a Swiss watch, calculating exactly how many ways a case had just become unlosable. "Hank," he said finally, "this is extraordinary. This is time-stamped, cloud-stored evidence of premeditated action, entered into the property before any legal authority existed, combined with the trust violation and the expired POA." He paused. "Combined with everything. This is devastating." "I know," I'll integrate it into the filing. This changes the timeline of the entire case. It establishes intent prior to any legal mechanism. A judge will see this and understand immediately that the POA wasn't a response to a crisis. It was a formality applied after the fact to legitimize something that had already begun. Do what you need to do, Earl. I trust you. I know you do. And Hank? Yeah, don't tell anyone about the cameras. Not Claire. Not Bud. Nobody. The fewer people who know, the more powerful it is when we present it. I agreed. And then I got to work. The next day, I drove out to the farm and made 2 phone calls. Jimmy Dawson picked up on the 3rd ring. Carlos Medina picked up on the 1st. Jimmy and Carlos. I need to tell you about them briefly, because they matter. Not just for what they did, but for what they represented. Jimmy was 60 years old, a former heavy equipment operator who had worked on the same bridge crew as me for 12 years in the early 90s. He had forearms like dock ropes and a laugh that could be heard across a construction site, and he owed me a favor that went back to 1997 when I drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to help him move his mother out of a flooded house in Sevierville. Carlos was 58, a Finnish carpenter who had subcontracted on several of my projects and who I'd recommended for a state contract in 2008 that had kept his business alive through the recession. He told me once that if I ever needed anything at all, to call. So I called, and they came. We went to work on the farmhouse the way men work when they know exactly what they're building and why it matters. Not frantically, not desperately, methodically, the way I had worked my entire career, measuring twice, cutting once, trusting the process, because the process was designed to produce something that lasts. New porch railing, white oak, hand-cut and fitted to match Daniel's original design. Fresh exterior stain, deep walnut, rich and warm against the weathered cedar siding. The floors inside, Daniel's original pine, sanded and refinished until they glowed like honey in the afternoon light. The kitchen, gutted carefully and rebuilt with new countertops, modern fixtures, a gas range that made the whole room feel like somewhere you'd actually want to stand and cook a meal at the end of a long day. A gas fireplace insert for the living room fitted into Daniel's stone surround because the stones were perfect and the firebox just needed updating. New windows in the upstairs bedrooms, a fresh coat of paint throughout, warm whites and soft grays that let the wood and the stone do the talking. My hands were still recovering. The right one especially, still weaker than the left, still reminding me every morning that 6 weeks ago it had been unable to squeeze a therapy ball. But it held a paintbrush, it held a hammer, it held a sanding block and moved it back and forth across pine floors until the grain showed through like something that had been waiting underneath all along, patient, hidden, ready to be revealed when someone finally did the work, healing and building at the same time. That's how I'd done everything my whole life, with both hands and more stubbornness than sense. And I wasn't about to change the method now. 3 weeks of building, 3 weeks of sawdust and paint fumes, and the particular satisfaction of watching something broken become something whole again. And through all of it, like a radio broadcast from another life, Bud Watkins kept me informed. He called every few days, always in the evening, always from his porch, always with Captain providing background commentary in the form of occasional groans and one memorable bark that Bud attributed to Douglas doing something offensive with the garden hose. She painted your living room, Hank. This was week 2. You told me. Sage green. I know I told you. I'm telling you again because I drove past this morning and I could see it through the window, and it has not improved with time. That color belongs in a dentist's waiting room, not in a house with character. Noted, Bud. Also, Douglas is still pruning your roses. He's still doing it wrong. He's cutting flat across the top like he's giving them a haircut. Roses aren't hedges, Hank. They're living things. They have feelings. Probably. I appreciate your dedication to their well-being. Someone has to care. Captain and I have discussed it. and were both concerned. Bud also reported that Pamela had hosted 2 more dinner parties, that she had replaced the mailbox, my mailbox, the one I'd built from leftover cedar planks after a storm knocked down the original, with a store-bought brass model that Bud described as aggressively suburban. She had also, according to Bud's meticulous notes, begun receiving packages. Frequent ones. Furniture catalogs. Home improvement deliveries. The steady supply chain of a woman furnishing a home she believed she owned permanently. "She settled in, Hank," Bud said one evening, his voice dropping into the register he used when he was being serious rather than entertaining. "Really settled in. Like concrete." "Good," I said. "Let her cure." Meanwhile, Earl was building something of his own. Something made not of wood and stone but of documents and dates, and the kind of evidence that doesn't make a sound until it detonates. He called me once a week with updates. Always brief. Always precise. Because Earl Patterson did not believe in wasting words any more than he believed in wasting motions. Week 1 after filing preparations began. 3 independent attorneys have reviewed the trust documentation, the POA expiration, and the transfer paperwork. All 3 agree. The transfer is void on multiple grounds. "We have overlapping arguments, Hank. That's the best position you can be in. If one argument fails, the next one catches." Week 2. The camera footage has been authenticated and preserved through a certified digital forensics process. Chain of custody is clean. Timestamps are verified against hospital records. Pamela Whitfield entered the property 41 hours before the power of attorney was activated. That gap is a canyon, and there's no bridge across it. He paused. "No offense. None taken." Week 3. I've also been running standard background due diligence on the Whitfields. Litigation history. Property records. Business filings. Another pause. Longer this time. "I'm finding some interesting history, Hank. I'm not ready to discuss it yet. When I am, we'll talk." I didn't push. Earl had earned 40 years of my trust, and I wasn't about to start micromanaging him now. If he said he'd found something, he'd found something. If he said he wasn't ready, he wasn't ready. The man worked like a bridge engineer, which is to say he didn't show you the structure until every bolt was in place and every load had been calculated. On the 21st day after I'd started, I put down the paintbrush, walked through the farmhouse one final time, and stepped out onto the back porch. Daniel's porch. The one he'd built the summer I got married. The one with the railing he'd cut from local oak and fitted without a single nail because Daniel believed that joinery done right didn't need anything but itself. The Smokies were doing their evening performance. Gold light running along the ridgeline. The valleys already filling with purple shadow. The air carrying that particular autumn chill that makes you want coffee and a chair and nowhere else to be. I had both. Jimmy had found 2 Adirondack chairs at a barn sale in Townsend, solid cedar, built by someone who knew what they were doing. And we'd placed them on the porch facing the mountains. I sat in one of those chairs with a cup of coffee. Black. 2 sugars. And I looked at what I'd done. The farmhouse was transformed. Not flashy. Not magazine ready. Something better than that. It looked like a place where a life could happen, where mornings could start slow and evenings could end quiet, and the space between could hold whatever needed holding. The deep walnut stain on the exterior glowed warm in the fading light. The new windows caught the last of the sun and threw it back. Daniel's stone chimney stood exactly as it had for decades, unchanged. Because some things don't need improvement. They just need someone to build the rest of the house around them with equal care. I thought about my brother. About the way he'd set up the trust so the farm would be here when someone needed it. About the way he'd built this porch so it would outlast him, and it had by 8 years and counting. About the way some men leave things behind that keep working long after they're gone. Quiet machines of foresight and love that the people they were built for don't fully understand until the moment they need them most. "Thank you, Daniel," I said to the empty chair beside me. The mountains didn't answer. But the evening light shifted. Just slightly. In a way that felt like enough. My phone rang. Earl, Hank. His voice had that quality it gets when he's been saving something. The sound of a man who has finished building and is ready to show you what he's made. We need to talk. I found something about the Whitfields. And it changes everything. Some people leave a trail. Not because they're careless exactly, but because they've done something enough times that they stop believing anyone is looking. They develop a rhythm, a method, the confidence of repetition, and that confidence, eventually, is what makes them visible to someone like Earl Patterson, who had spent 40 years learning that the most important thing about any legal case is not what happened, but whether it happened before. I drove to Earl's office the next morning. It was a small firm on the second floor of a brick building on Gay Street, downtown Knoxville. 2 rooms, a reception area with a leather couch that had been there since the 90s, and Earl's office, which looked exactly the way you'd expect the office of a 65-year-old attorney to look. Bookshelves on 3 walls, diplomas nobody bothered to read, and a desk covered in the kind of organized chaos that only makes sense to the person sitting behind it. Earl was sitting behind it. Folders spread out in front of him, like a map of somewhere I hadn't been yet. "Sit down," he said. I sat. 6 years ago, Earl began, and his voice had the particular cadence it took on when he was presenting something he'd spent a long time assembling and wanted delivered correctly. Pamela and Douglas Whitfield lived in Shelby County, Tennessee. Memphis. They lived in a neighborhood called Raleigh, in a house on Covington Pike, about half a mile from an elderly man named Harold Jennings. He opened the first folder. Harold Jennings. 78 years old at the time. Widower. Retired. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam. Came home. Built a life. Worked 30 years at a manufacturing plant and owned his house outright. Paid off. No mortgage, clean title. A man who had earned everything he had the hard way and kept it through discipline. I listened. Harold's son Richard had married a young woman named Denise, who, as it happens, was active in the same church group as Pamela Whitfield. The Ladies' Auxiliary. Bake sales. Mission trips. The kind of organization where people trust each other because they believe they share values. Earl looked up from the folder. Pamela and Denise were close. Close enough that when Harold suffered a major stroke and was hospitalized, Denise turned to Pamela for guidance, for help, for advice on how to handle the financial and legal complications of caring for an incapacitated parent. The room was very quiet. I could hear the clock on Earl's wall. I could hear traffic on Gay Street 2 floors below. I could hear the slow, careful sound of a story that was going somewhere I didn't want it to go but needed to follow anyway. A power of attorney was activated. Denise was the designated agent, and while Harold was in a care facility, unable to speak, unable to protest, unable to do anything at all, that power of attorney was used to transfer Harold's house into a limited liability company. Earl paused. An LLC with Douglas Whitfield's name quietly attached to it. I closed my eyes. Harold never got his house back, Hank. He spent the next 2 years in that care facility. He died there. The case was investigated briefly. Insufficient evidence at the time. The family had already relocated, and the matter was dropped. Life moved on. Another pause. Until I found it. I sat there for a long time, looking at the folders on Earl's desk, thinking about a man I had never met. Harold Jennings. A veteran. A widower. A man who had served his country and come home and done the quiet, unglamorous work of building a life. Brick by brick. Payment by payment. Year by year. And he had lost it all to people who brought casseroles and smiled and joined the church group and waited, with a patience that I now recognized as predatory, for the right moment of vulnerability. "This isn't just your case anymore, Hank." Earl's voice was steady. "What we have here is a pattern of behavior, a methodology. Your situation wasn't a family making bad decisions under pressure. It wasn't Claire panicking. It wasn't hospital bills. It was something they've done before. Something they were apparently comfortable doing. A system. How did they get away with it? Because Harold didn't have an Earl. He didn't have a Bud. He didn't have a family trust, or cloud cameras, or a brother who'd built him a fallback that nobody knew about. Harold had a stroke and a daughter-in-law who trusted the wrong woman, and by the time anyone thought to ask questions, the answers had already left town. I thought about that for a long time. A man sitting alone in a care facility, looking at a ceiling that wasn't his, in a room that wasn't his, knowing that the house he'd paid off and maintained and lived in for decades was gone, signed away by someone he'd trusted, orchestrated by someone who smiled while she did it. Harold's family, I said. His daughter. She's in Nashville. Her name is Regina. I've already located her. Send her what you found. All of it. She deserves to know. Earl nodded once. I'll handle it. Then he straightened the folders, aligned them with the edge of his desk the way he aligned everything in his life, with precision and purpose, and looked at me. Here's where we are. The trust violation. The expired POA. The camera footage, establishing premeditation. 3 independent legal opinions. Bud's documentation. And now the Memphis precedent establishing a pattern of predatory property acquisition targeting vulnerable individuals. He folded his hands. We file Tuesday morning. I looked at the folders. At the desk. At Earl. Sitting there in his rolled sleeves and wire-rimmed glasses, a man who had spent 40 years doing this kind of work and still cared enough to do it right. Tuesday, I said. Tuesday. I stood up and walked to the window. Gay Street was busy below. People walking, cars moving. The ordinary machinery of a city going about its business. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary life, an extraordinary thing was about to happen. A man who had been left for finished was about to prove that he was anything but. Earl. Yeah, thank you. For Harold, too. He didn't say anything to that. He just nodded. Once. The way Earl nodded. Which was enough. The Tuesday Earl had circled on his legal pad arrived the way most important days do without announcement. No thunder, no omen. Just a clear October sky over Knoxville and the smell of fresh coffee in a paper cup. I drove to the Knox County Courthouse in Earl's truck because my own was still parked in the garage at Laurel Avenue, the garage that now housed Douglas Whitfield's pearl white Buick. I wore the only suit I still owned, a charcoal 2-button I'd bought for Daniel's funeral 8 years prior. It still fit, though it hung a little looser through the shoulders. 24 days in a coma and 6 weeks of recovery will do that to a man. Earl had prepared the filing himself. 47 pages. A civil complaint naming Douglas R. Whitfield, Pamela S. Whitfield, and Derek M. Whitfield as defendants. The causes of action read like a blueprint of everything they'd done wrong. Breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent conveyance, unauthorized exercise of an expired power of attorney, violation of the Caldwell Family Land Trust of 1,941, and the one Earl saved for last, a pattern of predatory property acquisition supported by the Harold Jennings case in Memphis. We walked through the courthouse metal detector at 8:47 inches the morning. Earl carried a brown leather briefcase that had belonged to his father. Also a lawyer. Also a man who believed that patience was a legal strategy. The clerk at the civil filing window was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain. She accepted the documents, stamped them twice, and handed Earl a case number. That was it. No drama, no speeches, just ink on paper and the quiet machinery of the law beginning to turn. Earl and I sat on a wooden bench in the hallway afterward. He opened his briefcase and pulled out 2 bottles of sweet tea he'd packed that morning. To Harold, he said, raising his bottle. To Harold, I said. We drank in silence. Somewhere down the corridor a door closed, and the sound echoed off the marble floor like a period at the end of a long sentence. By noon, the defendants had been served. Earl had hired a licensed process server, a tall, patient man named Gerald, who'd been doing the job for 19 years and had a talent for finding people who didn't want to be found. Gerald didn't need his talent that day. He found Pamela Whitfield at 1412 Laurel Avenue, standing in the front doorway of my house, wearing an apron I didn't recognize. She accepted the documents with both hands. Gerald told Earl she read the first page, then closed the door without a word. Douglas was served at his insurance office on Kingston Pike at 12:34. Derek, at a sandwich shop near the university at 1:15. Claire was served last. At the house. At 2:07 the afternoon. Gerald said she sat down on the porch steps, my porch steps, the ones I'd rebuilt in 2009 with pressure-treated pine and stainless steel screws, and didn't move for a long time. I won't pretend I didn't feel something when Earl told me that. I'm not made of bridge steel. She's still my daughter. She was still the girl who used to sit on those same steps with a bowl of cereal, watching the cardinals in the holly bush. But feeling something and stopping are two different things. A man can grieve and still swing a hammer. I'd learned that when Karen left. I learned it again when Daniel died. And I was learning it now. The phone rang at 6:14 that evening. I was on the back porch of the Maryville farmhouse, watching the last copper light slide off the ridgeline. The number on the screen was Claire's. I let it ring 4 times. Not because I was uncertain, because I wanted her to feel each one. "Dad," she said. "Claire, everyone is upset. Pamela is calling lawyers. Douglas hasn't spoken since lunch. Derek keeps asking me what I knew." "What did you know, Claire?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd heard since the day she told me about the house. I could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven. The way she used to breathe when she was 7 and had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball and was trying to decide between the truth and a story. "I knew some of it," she said. "Not all of it. Not about Memphis. Not about the other man. His name was Harold Jennings," I said. "He was 78 years old. He served in Vietnam. He died in a care facility in Shelby County because the people your in-laws are connected to took his home the same way they tried to take mine." Another silence. Longer this time. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know you are," I said. "But sorry is a word. What I need are answers. In a courtroom. Under oath." I hung up and set the phone on the arm of the Adirondack chair. The mountains were purple now, the creek at the tree line catching the last of the light. Captain Bud's old golden retriever would have liked it here, I thought. Then I thought about Daniel and the porch he built, and how the boards beneath me hadn't shifted a quarter inch in 30 years. Some things hold. Some things don't. The difference is in the foundation. Earl called an hour later. Short and professional. Pamela hired Arthur Grimes. Corporate litigator, downtown firm. Expensive suits. Billable hours like a taxi meter. He filed a motion to dismiss by end of day. "Expected," I said. "Expected." Earl agreed. "Judge Wren has the case. She doesn't like rushed motions or expensive suits. Hearing is set for November 14th, 3 weeks away. 21 days. I'd spent 28 in a coma. I could wait. The 21 days between the filing and the hearing moved the way water moves through limestone slow on the surface, relentless underneath. I spent most of that time at the Maryville farm. Jimmy Dawson finished the last of the exterior work during the first week. New gutters along the east side, a repaired section of the barn roof where a poplar limb had come down 2 winters back, and a fresh coat of deep walnut stain on the porch railing that made the whole front of the house look like it had straightened its shoulders. Carlos Medina installed the final kitchen cabinet, a corner unit with a lazy Susan that I'd sketched on a napkin at a diner in Townsend, and then stood back with his arms folded and nodded once, which from Carlos was the equivalent of a standing ovation. I cooked my first real meal in that kitchen on a Wednesday evening. Nothing elaborate. Pan-roe-fried trout from the creek, roasted sweet potatoes, cornbread from a cast-iron skillet that had been Daniel's. The skillet was the one thing I'd taken from the farmhouse after his funeral. Everything else I'd left in place, as if the house were a clock I didn't want to stop. Now I was winding it again, room by room, and the ticking felt steady. Earl called every other day. His updates were precise, unhurried, delivered in that low baritone that made even bad news sound like something a reasonable man could handle. Week 1. Arthur Grimes, filed the motion to dismiss. His argument was, procedural claimed the Caldwell Family Land Trust had been functionally dormant since 1973, and that Hank had effectively abandoned his claim by not contesting the POA within a statutory window. Earl called the argument creative, the way an engineer might call a bridge built out of cardboard creative. Week 2. Judge Wren denied the motion to dismiss in a 2-page order. She noted that the trust had been continuously funded through property tax payments, which I had made every January for 27 years, and that a man in a medically induced coma could not reasonably be expected to contest a legal instrument he didn't know existed. Earl read me the final sentence over the phone. The court finds sufficient grounds to proceed to an evidentiary hearing. I wrote that sentence on a scrap of 2B4 with a carpenter's pencil and set it on the mantel above Daniel's fireplace. Week 3. Bud Watkins delivered his last field report. Pamela had stopped hosting dinners. Douglas had not been seen in the garden for 9 days. A moving truck, small, the kind you rent by the hour, appeared in the driveway on a Saturday morning, stayed 40 minutes, and left. Bud photographed the license plate out of habit. Derek's car had not been in the driveway for 5 consecutive days. Claire's gray sedan, however, was there every night. She's alone in that house most evenings, Bud said on the phone. Lights on in the kitchen until about 11. Then the bedroom. Your old bedroom. Then dark. I didn't ask how he knew which room was which. Bud had been inside that house 100 times over 22 years. He'd sat at that kitchen table for Thanksgiving dinners and Sunday football games, and the quiet Tuesday evening after Dolores died, when he came over with a bottle of bourbon, and neither of us said much of anything for 3 hours. She feeding Captain? I asked. Every morning. Puts the bowl on the porch at 7:15. He waits by the fence until she comes out. That detail settled somewhere in my chest like a stone finding the bottom of a river. My daughter, alone in my house, feeding my neighbor's old dog every morning while the people who'd orchestrated this whole arrangement quietly retreated. I didn't know what that meant yet. I wasn't ready to decide. Earl came to the farm on the Sunday before the hearing. He brought a file box, 2 legal pads, and a bag of barbecue from a place on Chapman Highway that had been smoking pork since before either of us could drive. We sat on the front porch, Daniel's porch, and he walked me through the hearing plan. Judge Wren will hear arguments and evidence. It's not a full trial. Think of it as a structural inspection. He looked at me over his glasses. She's going to look at the foundation and decide whether the building stands or comes down. I know something about that, I said. Earl smiled, a rare event, like seeing a hawk land on a fence post. Then, he opened the first legal pad. The evidence was organized in 3 columns, the same way I used to organize bridge inspection reports. What we know, what we can prove, what they can't explain, what we know. Pamela Whitfield entered my house 41 hours before the POA was activated. She changed the locks. She measured rooms. She brought a woman later identified as a residential appraiser named Linda Dwyer to assess the property's value. All of this happened while I was unconscious in a hospital bed with a tube in my throat. What we can prove. Cloud camera footage with embedded timestamps. Bud's photographic log with dates, times, and plate numbers. The Caldwell Family Land Trust document requiring 3 signatures. The POA expiration clause. The Memphis case file on Harold Jennings, showing Douglas Whitfield's name on an LLC that acquired Harold's property under nearly identical circumstances. What they can't explain. Why Pamela had a key made before the POA existed. Why an appraiser visited the property within 72 hours of my hospitalization. Why Douglas Whitfield's name appears on 2 separate property acquisitions involving incapacitated elderly homeowners in 2 different Tennessee counties. Earl closed the pad. Any questions? 1, I said. What time do we need to be there? 8:30. Courtroom 4B. Wear the charcoal suit. It's the only one I own. Then the decision's already made. I walked him to the truck. The sun was going down behind the Smokies, painting the ridgeline in shades of copper and ash. The air smelled like wood smoke and fallen leaves, and something underneath both of those, something cold and clean, the way November smells when it's done pretending to be autumn and starts being honest about winter. I stood on the porch until his taillights disappeared down Caldwell Road. Then I went inside, hung the charcoal suit on the back of the bedroom door, and sat in the chair by the window. Tomorrow was Monday. Tuesday was the hearing. 24 days in a coma, 6 weeks of recovery, 7 weeks of silence, 3 weeks of waiting. And now, one night, I turned off the lamp and let the dark come in. Courtroom 4B, in the Knox County Courthouse, smelled like old wood polish and recycled air. The benches were oak, darkened by decades of anxious hands gripping the edges. The fluorescent lights above hummed at a frequency just below, hearing the kind of sound you don't notice until someone points it out, and then you can't stop noticing it. I noticed it the moment I sat down. Earl and I took the plaintiff's table at 8:22. He arranged his documents in 3 stacks. Trust, POA, camera evidence, each clipped with a different color. Blue, red, green. He'd been doing that since law school, he told me once. Said it helped the judge see that the argument had structure. I understood that. A bridge has structure too. You don't build the deck before the piers are set. Arthur Grimes arrived at 8:31 with 2 junior associates and a rolling briefcase that probably cost more than my first truck. He wore a navy suit with a silver tie clip shaped like a gavel, which I thought was a choice. Douglas and Pamela Whitfield sat behind him in the first row. Douglas wore a sport coat and kept his hands folded in his lap, the way a man does when he's been told to sit still and say nothing. Pamela wore a cream-colored blouse and a string of pearls and an expression of absolute composure, the kind that takes practice. Derek was not present. Claire was. She sat in the 3rd row, alone, wearing the gray cardigan. She didn't look at me when I walked in. She didn't look at Pamela either. She looked straight ahead at the seal of the state of Tennessee, mounted on the wall behind the judge's bench, and she didn't blink for a long time. Judge Margaret Wren entered at 8:35. She was somewhere in her late 50s, with short silver hair and reading glasses that she wore on a plain black cord. She moved with the economy of someone who had heard 10,000 arguments and had learned to separate the ones that mattered from the ones that were designed to delay. She sat, opened a file, and looked at Earl. "Mr. Patterson, you may proceed." Earl stood the way he did everything, without hurry, without hesitation. He began with the Caldwell Family Land Trust. He explained its establishment in 1941 by my grandfather, its amendment in 1973 by my father, its requirement of 3 living Caldwell signatures for any transfer of the Laurel Avenue property. He placed the original trust document on the evidence table. He placed the county tax records beside it, 27 years of payments, every January, in my name. Then he moved to the power of attorney. He read the activation clause aloud. The POA granted Claire Caldwell Whitfield authority to manage Hank Caldwell's financial affairs in the event of medical incapacitation, effective from the date of notarization and expiring upon the principal's restoration of legal capacity. He placed the hospital discharge summary beside it. The dates didn't lie. The POA had expired 11 days before the property transfer was executed. Grimes objected. Said the POA's expiration was ambiguous and subject to interpretation. Judge Wren looked at him over her glasses and said, "The document contains the word expiring, Mr. Grimes." "I don't find that ambiguous. Continue, Mr. Patterson." Earl moved to the camera footage. He'd had it authenticated by a digital forensics firm in Nashville, timestamps verified, metadata intact, chain of custody documented. He played 4 clips on a courtroom monitor. The first showed Pamela Whitfield arriving at 1412 Laurel Avenue at 9:42 on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after my hospitalization, 41 hours before the POA was notarized. The second showed a locksmith changing the front door lock at her direction. The third showed Linda Dwyer, identified by name, through her state appraiser's license, walking through the property with Pamela on day 6. The fourth showed Claire and Derek entering with a newly cut key on day 9. The courtroom was very quiet during those clips. The only sound was the fluorescent hum and the faint click of the monitor's built-in speakers. I watched Pamela's face. Her composure held, but her left hand moved to her pearl necklace and stayed there. Earl's final exhibit was the Memphis file. Harold Jennings, a 78-year G veteran, a house on Poplar Avenue, an LLC called Ridgeline Property Partners, registered to Douglas R. Whitfield, a power of attorney held by Harold's daughter-in-law. A transfer executed while Harold was in a rehabilitation facility, following a hip replacement. Harold died 14 months later in a state-funded care facility in Shelby County. His daughter Regina had never been notified. Earl placed the LLC registration beside the Knox County complaint and let the two documents sit next to each other on the evidence table like bones laid out on an examination cloth. "Your Honor," he said, "this is not a family dispute about a house. This is a pattern." Grimes stood to respond. He spoke for 11 minutes. He questioned the relevance of the Memphis case. He argued that Claire had acted in good faith. He suggested that Hank Caldwell's relationship with his daughter had been strained prior to the hospitalization, implying that the POA was a reasonable precaution. He used the phrase, "loving family decision," 3 times. Judge Wren listened. She took no notes during Grimes's argument. She had taken 6 pages of notes during Earl's. When Grimes sat down, the courtroom went still. Judge Wren removed her glasses, set them on the bench, and looked at the documents one more time. Then she spoke. 7 sentences. The Caldwell family land. Trust of 1,941 is valid and enforceable. The transfer of the property at 1412 Laurel Avenue was executed without the required signatures and in violation of the trust terms. The power of attorney cited as authorization had expired under its own language prior to the date of transfer. The video evidence presented establishes that the defendants accessed and altered the property before any legal authority existed to do so. The court finds the transfer void. Title to the property at 1412 Laurel Avenue is restored to Henry Daniel Caldwell, effective immediately. Costs and attorney's fees are awarded to the plaintiff, and this matter is referred to the district attorney's office for further review. 7 sentences. That's all it took. 47 pages of complaint. 27 years of tax payments. 4 camera angles. 1 dead veteran in Memphis. And a judge who understood that some things either hold or they don't. Earl closed his briefcase. I stood. My hands were steady, and I was grateful for that. Behind me, I heard Pamela's chair push back against the floor. Pamela Whitfield caught up with me in the hallway outside courtroom 4B. Her heels struck the marble floor in a rhythm that was too fast to be dignified and too controlled to be panic. I heard her before I saw her. The way you hear a crack in a load-bearing wall before you see the fracture line. "Mr. Caldwell." I stopped. Earl, 2 steps ahead of me, turned and placed one hand on his briefcase strap. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. 35 years of practicing law in East Tennessee had taught him when to talk and when to let the other side do the damage themselves. Pamela's composure was still there, but it had shifted. The pearls were straight. The blouse was pressed, but her eyes had changed. They were harder now. "No. You think this is over?" she said. "The judge seemed to think so," I said. "Judges can be appealed. Rulings can be overturned. You don't know who we know." Earl stepped forward. Not aggressively. Earl never did anything aggressively, but with the slow, deliberate weight of a man who had already won and wanted to make sure the other side understood that completely. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "the ruling has been referred to the district attorney. Any further contact with my client outside of legal channels will be documented and submitted as evidence of harassment. I'd encourage you to discuss next steps with Mr. Grimes." Pamela looked at Earl the way someone looks at a locked door. Then she looked at me. For a moment, maybe 2 seconds. Maybe 3, something passed behind her eyes that might have been calculation, or might have been the first honest emotion I'd ever seen from her. Fear. Not of me. Not of Earl. of the things she hadn't planned for. Consequences. Douglas appeared behind her. He put a hand on her elbow. She shook it off without looking at him, turned, and walked toward the elevator. Her heels echoed down the corridor, each step a little faster than the last, until the sound folded into the general noise of the courthouse and disappeared. Douglas lingered. He looked at me with an expression I'd seen before on job sites, the look of a man who had followed someone else's blueprint and was only now realizing the foundation was wrong. He opened his mouth, closed it, and followed his wife. I watched them go. Then I turned to Earl. "Barbecue?" I said. "Chapman Highway," he said. We ate pulled pork and coleslaw at a picnic table outside the restaurant, under a red wine-striped awning that had been there since the Clinton administration. Neither of us said much. Earl ate methodically, the way he did everything. I ate slowly because my appetite was still catching up to the rest of me. A mockingbird sat on the fence rail beside the parking lot and cycled through 4 different songs in the time it took me to finish half a sandwich. Earl wiped his hands, balled up the napkin, and said, "When do you want to go home?" I looked at him. "Today." We drove to Laurel Avenue in the late afternoon. The oaks along the street had turned golds and deep reds against a sky the color of faded denim. Bud Watkins was on his front porch across the street, sitting in the metal glider he'd bought at a yard sale 11 years ago. Captain lay at his feet, chin on paws, ears up. Bud raised a hand when we pulled into the driveway. Nothing dramatic, just a hand, steady and open, the way a man waves when he's been waiting and isn't surprised you've arrived. The house at 1412 Laurel Avenue looked the same from the outside. Same roofline I'd repaired in 2014. Same brick I'd pressure washed every spring. Same holly bushes along the front walk, though they needed trimming. The brass mailbox Pamela had installed caught the late sun and threw a small rectangle of gold onto the front steps. My front steps, the ones I'd rebuilt in 2009. Earl handed me a key. Not the original. That lock had been changed by Pamela's locksmith on day 3. This was a new one, cut that morning by a locksmith Earl had called before the hearing, a quiet act of faith in the outcome. I put the key in the lock. It turned with a clean, mechanical click. I pushed the door open and stood on the threshold. The living room had been painted sage green. The curtains were cream-colored, not the navy ones I'd hung in 2017. The hardwood floors I'd laid in 2001 were scuffed in new places. The couch was different leather, dark brown. Not the gray fabric sectional I'd picked out with Claire when she was 19. The bookshelf was still there, but the books were rearranged, and 3 of the shelves held decorative objects I didn't recognize. A ceramic bowl, a brass candlestick, a framed photograph of a beach I'd never visited. I walked through each room the way an inspector walks through a structure after a storm. Kitchen. New backsplash. White subway tile. Well installed, but not what I would have chosen. My cast iron skillet, the one that wasn't Daniel's, was gone from the hook beside the stove. Master bedroom. Different bedding. Different curtains. A faint scent of perfume that wasn't Claire's. Guest room. The walls I'd repainted 4 times were now a pale lavender. The closet held 2 suitcases I didn't recognize, and a row of Douglas's sport coats on wooden hangers. The garage was the hardest. My tools were gone. The pegboard where I'd hung 30 years of wrenches, levels, clamps, and hand planes was empty, except for a few nails and the faint outlines where each tool had blocked the dust. My workbench, built from reclaimed oak in 1998, was still there, but someone had placed cardboard boxes on top of it, the kind you get from a moving company. They were sealed and labeled in handwriting I didn't know. I stood in that garage for a long time, longer than I stood in any other room, because a man's tools are not just metal and wood. They're the record of what he's built. Every scratch on a chisel handle, every stain on a saw blade, every worn groove in a tape measure, those are chapters. And someone had removed them the way you'd remove books from a shelf, without reading them, without knowing what they contained. Bud appeared in the open garage door. He had a mug of coffee in each hand. "Figured you'd end up in here," he said. I took the mug. It was warm. The coffee was black. No sugar. Exactly right. "They boxed up your tools," Bud said. "Put them in a storage unit on Clinton Highway." I followed the truck. "Unit number 14. Here." He pulled a slip of paper from his shirt pocket and handed it to me. On it, in Bud's careful block letters, was the address and unit number. "You followed the truck," I said. "Captain and I needed the exercise." I laughed. It came out rough and thin, like a machine that hadn't been started in months. But it came out, and Bud smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since Dolores, and we stood there in my empty garage, drinking coffee, while the afternoon light fell through the open door and laid a long gold stripe across the floor. I started with the garage, not because it was the most important room, because it was the room that felt the most stolen. A kitchen can be repainted. Curtains can be changed. But an empty pegboard is a specific kind of silence, the kind that tells you someone looked at 30 years of your work and decided it was in the way. Bud drove me to the storage unit on Clinton Highway the next morning. Unit 14. A rolling metal door, a padlock with a combination I didn't know. Bud pulled a small bolt cutter from under his truck seat with the casualness of a man who'd anticipated this exact problem. I didn't ask questions. Some friendships operate on a frequency that doesn't require explanation. Inside, my tools were packed in 11 cardboard boxes. Unlabeled, stacked without logic. Whoever had packed them hadn't known what they were handling. A framing square was wedged against a set of carbide router bits. My grandfather's handplane, a Stanley No. 4, 1947. With a walnut handle worn smooth by 3 generations of Caldwell palms, was wrapped in a bath towel and placed upside down at the bottom of a box filled with extension cords. I held it for a moment, the way you hold something that has survived a flood. Then I set it on the truck's tailgate and kept unpacking. It took 4 trips to bring everything home. By Saturday evening, the pegboard was full again. Every wrench back on its hook. Every level. Every clamp, every chisel in its place. The outlines on the board matched again, tool and shadow reunited. Like a word returned to a sentence where it had always belonged. I stood in the doorway and looked at that wall. The way I imagine a librarian looks at a shelf, after the books have been returned. Not triumphant. Just right. The rest of the house took longer. I worked alone mostly. Not because I didn't have help. Jimmy offered twice, Carlos once, but because some repairs need to be personal. A man takes his house back with his own hands, or he doesn't really take it back at all. I removed the sage green paint in the living room over the course of 4 days, sanded it down to the original plaster, primed it, and rolled on 2 coats of warm white, the same shade I'd used in 2011. The cream curtains came down and went into a donation bag. I hung new ones. Soft navy, heavier weight. A cotton linen blend I found at a shop in Market Square. The leather couch I donated to a veteran shelter on Magnolia Avenue. I didn't replace it immediately. The room needed to breathe before I decided what went back in. The kitchen backsplash I left. Pamela's contractor had done good work. Clean lines, even grout. Proper spacing. I could respect competence even when I couldn't respect the person who'd ordered it. I bought a new cast iron skillet at a hardware store in Maryville and seasoned it on the stove with flaxseed oil, 3 coats, the way my mother taught me. It wasn't Daniel's. It wasn't my old one, but it would build its own history in time. The guest room I repainted for the 5th time. This time I chose a color called Morning Fog, a gray-blue that reminded me of the Smokies at dawn. The way the ridgeline softens before the sun defines it. I thought about the fact that I'd painted that room 4 times before. Once when Claire was born, once when she started school, once when she left for college, and once when she married Derek. Each coat a chapter. This one was different. This one was mine alone. 3 weeks after the hearing, on a Thursday evening, Claire's gray sedan pulled into the driveway. I was on the front porch, sitting in a wooden rocker I'd brought from the Maryville farm. The rocker had been Daniel's. He'd built it from hickory in 1994. Shaped the arms with a spoke shave, sanded the seat until it was smooth as riverstone. I'd carried it to Laurel Avenue because certain things belong where the family gathers, even when the family is only one person and a memory. She got out of the car slowly. No gray cardigan this time. She wore a green jacket, olive, practical, zipped to the collar against the November chill. Her hair was pulled back. She carried nothing in her hands. No coffee, no documents, no prepared defense. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. The same steps she'd sat on after being served. The same steps where she'd eaten cereal as a girl and watched cardinals in the holly bush. She looked up at me the way a person looks at a building they're not sure is safe to enter. "Dad," she said. "Claire, can I come up?" I didn't answer immediately. Not out of cruelty. Out of the understanding that some silences carry more weight than words, and this one needed to be felt by both of us before we could move through it. "Yes," I said. She climbed the 3 steps and sat in the chair beside mine, a green Adirondack I'd placed there that morning without knowing why. We didn't speak for a while. A cardinal landed in the holly bush beside the porch, tilted its head, and flew off. The evening light was amber and low, the kind that turns ordinary things into something worth remembering. I signed the papers because Pamela told me it was the only way to keep the house, Claire said. She said the medical bills would force a sale. She said if we didn't act, the bank would take it. She said you would have wanted it this way. And you believed her, I said. I was scared. You were in a coma. Derek said his mother knew about these things. I didn't think. No, I said. You didn't. She flinched. A small, involuntary tightening around her eyes that reminded me of the 7-year-old who'd broken a neighbor's window and was deciding between truth and a story. Only this time, she'd already chosen the story, and it had cost us both. I filed for divorce last week, she said. Derek didn't fight it. He was already staying at a friend's place in Farragut. I looked at her. 30 years old, her mother's cheekbones, her grandfather's stubbornness, and something in her posture that was entirely her own, a particular way of sitting very still when she was trying not to break. Are you all right? I said. No, she said. But I think I will be. I reached over and put my hand on the arm of her chair. Not on her hand. On the chair. Close enough to matter. Far enough to let her decide. She put her hand on mine. We sat there until the light was gone and the porch lamp came on automatically. The timer I'd installed in 2018, still keeping its schedule, still doing its small, faithful job in the dark. There's a term in engineering called load path. It describes the way force moves through a structure from the point of impact, through beams and columns and joints, down into the foundation, and finally into the earth. Every bridge I ever built had a load path. Every house I ever repaired had one. The principle is simple. If the path is continuous, the structure stands. If it's broken, everything above the break eventually comes down. I think about that now, most mornings. Sitting on the front porch of the Maryville farm with a cup of coffee and a view of the Smoky Mountains that hasn't changed since my brother Daniel built this porch 30 years ago. The hickory rocker is back here now. I brought it home from Laurel Avenue after I realized it belonged where he made it, not where I'd carried it. Some things should stay where they were built. Some things you have to move. The trick is knowing which is which. And that kind of knowing doesn't come from blueprints. It comes from loss. It's been 4 months since Judge Wren spoke those 7 sentences. 4 months since Pamela Whitfield's heels echoed down a courthouse hallway for the last time. Earl tells me the district attorney's office opened a formal investigation into the Whitfield property acquisitions, both mine and Harold Jennings's case in Memphis. Douglas and Pamela retained separate attorneys, which Earl says is the first sign of a partnership coming apart at the seams. I don't follow the details. That's Earl's work now. My work is different. I keep both properties. That was never the original plan. But plans change. when you learn what things are worth. Laurel Avenue is the house I built my life in 27 years of tax payments, hardwood floors I laid with my own hands, a guest room painted 5 times, a porch rebuilt in 2009, a pegboard that holds 30 years of tools and the shadows they leave behind. It's the house where I raised Claire. It's the house where Karen left. It's the house where Pamela Whitfield changed the locks 41 hours before she had any legal right to touch the door. And it's the house where a judge's 7 sentences put my name back on the deed. The Maryville farm is something else. 12 acres in a valley beneath mountains that were old before anyone in my family had a name. A creek that catches silver light in the morning. A barn with a red roof that Daniel repainted every 3 years because he said a barn should look like it gives a damn. A farmhouse with original pine floors. A stone fireplace. A kitchen with a lazy use and corner cabinet I sketched on a napkin, and a back porch where the sunset turns the ridgeline into copper and ash every evening, like it's practicing for a painting it will never finish. Daniel left me this place because he trusted me to take care of it. I failed that trust for 8 years. I locked the door after his funeral and drove away and told myself I'd come back when it didn't hurt. It never stopped hurting. I came back anyway. That's not courage. That's just what happens when someone tries to take everything else and you discover there's one thing they didn't know about. Claire comes to the farm on Sundays now. She drives down from Knoxville in the morning, brings groceries, and cooks lunch in the kitchen while I work on whatever needs working on. Last Sunday it was the barn door the bottom hinge had rusted through, and the door was dragging a quarter-inch groove into the concrete slab. The Sunday before that it was a fence post along the south meadow that had leaned past 15 degrees, which in my professional opinion is the point at which a fence post has stopped being a fence post and started being a suggestion. We don't talk about the hearing, we don't talk about Pamela or Douglas or Derek. We talk about the food, the weather, the property. She asked me last week if I'd teach her how to replace a porch board. I said yes. We spent an hour measuring, cutting, and fitting a single plank of pressure-treated pine into the gap where the old one had split. She countersunk the screws without being told. I didn't say anything about that. But I noticed. The divorce was finalized in January. She moved into a small apartment near the university, 2 bedrooms, a galley kitchen, a balcony that overlooks a parking lot, which she described as a view of concrete with a half-smile that reminded me so much of her mother that I had to look away for a second. She's working at an architecture firm downtown. Entry-level, long hours, modest pay. She seems steadier than she's been in years. I don't say that to her. Some observations are better kept on the blueprint than spoken aloud. Bud Watkins still lives across the street on Laurel Avenue. Captain passed in December quietly, on his dog bed, in the sunroom where Dolores used to read. Bud called me that evening, and I drove over and sat with him for 2 hours. We didn't say much. I brought the bourbon. He brought the silence. It was enough. I offered to help him build a marker for the backyard, and the following Saturday we set a flat river stone beneath the dogwood tree with Captain's name and 2 dates carved in block letters. Bud stood there for a long time afterward, hands in his pockets, looking at the stone the way you look at the last page of a book you didn't want to finish. Earl Patterson retired in February. He said he'd been planning it for 3 years, but I think the Caldwell case gave him the ending he wanted. His last act as a practicing attorney was to send a letter to Regina Jennings in Nashville, Harold's daughter, with a full copy of the court record and the contact information for a Memphis firm that agreed to take Harold's case pro bono. I don't know the outcome of that yet, but I know the letter was sent, and I know Earl hand-delivered it. And I know that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is make sure the next person in line has the documents they need. I'm 62 years old. I've built bridges that carry 10,000 cars a day. I've laid foundations in rock and clay and river sand. I've learned that the difference between a structure that stands and one that falls is not size or material or cost. It's continuity. It's whether the load path runs clean from the top of the structure all the way down into the ground without a single break. 24 days in a coma. 6 weeks of recovery. 7 weeks of silence. 3 weeks of waiting. 1 hearing. 7 sentences. And now this. A porch. A coffee. A mountain that doesn't move. A daughter who comes on Sundays. A friend across the street who still waves from his glider. A farm that my brother built and trusted me to keep. People ask me sometimes, not many people, but somehow I stayed so patient. How I didn't rage or break or burn it all down when I woke up and found my life in someone else's name. And I tell them what I know, which is the same thing I've known since the first day I set a footing in the ground and poured concrete around it. Patience isn't passive. Patience is the decision to let the weight find its path. To trust that if the foundation is good, the structure will hold. You don't fight gravity. You build with it. That's what I did. That's what holds.